Timothy Roy, doctoral student in composition here at the Shepherd School of Music. Thank you all for being here. It's been a few years since I've been back in Houston. Actually, it's been really wonderful. I've met some new folks who are new to the Shepherd School, new composers and musicians, and it's just been really nice to be back. And I wasn't expecting, honestly, I didn't know how many people were going to be here tonight, and this is beautiful. So thank you for being here. I just want to start by thanking some people before I get started with this lecture. First, I want to thank my performer, Hope Cowan, harpist, who you'll hear tonight. She's just been so wonderful, sounds great performing this piece, and has just been a lot of help through the whole process. I want to thank Doctors Kurt Stallman and Chapman Welch for just, honestly, years of help at this point, and mentorship, and just a lot of hard work that has been put in behind the scenes. Just incredible technical and personal and moral support. Thank you so much. I want to thank my committee members, Dr. Peter Lowen, Dr. Shui Chen. I want to thank someone who's not here tonight, Dr. Anna Klosowska, who is professor of French at Miami University in Ohio. I draw on her research a good amount, and she's corresponded with me and been very, very helpful and enthusiastic throughout this project. I'd like to thank former Dean Robert Yekovich. He supported me greatly during my years here at Rice, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you to our new and current Dean, Matthew Loden. Other members of the composition faculty with whom I've studied and learned from so much, Dr. Tony Brandt, Kareem Alzan, Richard Lavenda, Arthur Gottschalk, and Pierre Jalbert. I'd like to thank Gary Eckelmeyer for helping with the lighting. We were climbing up there a few days ago trying to get everything set, and it's looking really good. And finally, she's not here, but I'd like to thank my wife Sarah, who provided her singing voice to this project and gave me her blessing to do some strange things to it in some cases, and then regretted that after the fact once she heard it. No, she's okay. It's fine. Yeah, so as you can see on your program, tonight is going to consist of the performance of a new composition for harp and immersive electronics entitled Valentina V. And this will be preceded by a lecture, which after much deliberation I've decided to name Composing Under the Influence, pregnant pause, Mediation of the Extramusical in Valentina V. It's a little cliched to provide a two-part title separated by a colon, but you know, the title was clever, and I thought it needed clarification. So the title does refer to the fact that nearly all of my compositional work at this point arises out of engagement with things that are what we would call extramusical. And by that, I simply mean things that lie outside the discipline of music from a sheer ontological perspective. So things that could be considered extramusical would be imagery, nature, historical facts, society, politics, etc. And when I develop a work under the influence of the extramusical, it's the peculiar nature of these items, whatever they are, that uniquely affect my compositional decisions. These decisions are ones regarding selection and treatment of materials, musical structure, how that unfolds over time. If it's an electroacoustic work like the one tonight, how I'm processing the materials, the way that I treat the acoustic, or you know, try to emulate some acoustic that's not real, and so forth. Valentina V is the most mature example of my work that arises out of engagement with things that are extra musical. And this work is inspired by a particular figure from the Middle Ages, Valentina Visconti, as well as music that was written especially for her and the tragic circumstances of her life. So I'll start there. I'll start by explaining the historical source material that underlies Valentina V before discussing the piece itself. Several years ago, near the beginning of my coursework at Rice, I took a medieval music seminar with Dr. Peter Willen, and I chose as the topic of a final research paper a rather famous French secular song from the late 14th century entitled La Harpe de Mélodie. And I was playing a recording of this chanson as some of you were getting seated. The song isn't famous because the tune is well known necessarily, but because of its unusual score. So here it is, the written transmission of La Harpe de Mélodie in its beautiful pictographic form. We can see that the strings of the harp are serving as staff lines for the notes, and I'll give you a closer detail on that. I've rotated it clockwise so you can see these strings, these staff lines are now horizontal to our view. And you can see how the notes cling to the strings of the harp with the text laid out below. And you might notice another idiosyncrasy of this form of notation. The spaces between the staff lines are going completely unused. So what appears to be skips by thirds are actually just stepwise motion from one pitch to a pitch that sits immediately next to it. And so you might ask, why do this? It seems rather strange. Well, the fact is, these notes are attached to the strings as a powerful visual device that is tying the sound of the song to the physical material reality of the vibrating strings from which it's born. There's a musicologist I'll refer to a few times, Reinhard Strom, and he suggested that the composer's patron and commissioner would have distributed copies of the score to audience members, and during performance, listeners would have both heard the sound of the harp and then played it with their eyes by scanning the score. So essentially, you see the sound and you hear the image. Here's the text of the song in its original Old French and English translation. It's also on your program notes. I've highlighted a few key phrases that sum up the general gist of this song. It's a song all about the harp, the essence of the harp as an instrument. And it talks about how the harp is specifically made to bring visual and aural pleasure. It's, quote, created without melancholy, which sounds like, the composer is saying that the harp is essentially incapable of eliciting sadness. It's an instrument made to, quote, please find company and make, quote, a sweet sound without discord. It's one that you escape to when you want to abandon discontent. So I'll return to these sentiments later when discussing my own piece, which quotes melodic fragments from La Harpe de Mélodie in such a way as to actually ironically juxtapose these optimistic sentiments against a backdrop that's much darker. To talk about the music of the chanson, it's constructed fairly simply. We have a melodic line that's supported by a slower moving bass. In medieval parlance, the melodic voice is called the cantus and the bass voice is called the tenor. So that's what you see up there. Those are the ranges that the cantus and tenor lines are required to perform in. But although this piece is written, the notation only gives two voices. The song is actually a three-voice composition. And you might be asking how. Well, if we go back to the pictographic score, there it is on the left, and then I have a detail on the right of the rounded shoulder there. You can see there's a banner wrapped around the harp's frame, and the banner contains writing, and the script is already hard to read, and then it's Old French. But essentially what it says is it's a performance instruction from the composer, and it explains how a third voice can be derived if you take the melodic line and then you treat it in canon with itself. Like a round, like if you're singing a round, row, row, row your boat, or something like that. So when we write it out in full, and we have the canonic voice along with the melodic voice and the bass line, this is what the first system of the piece looks like. You can see that a second voice echoes the melodic cantus, and this happens the entire duration of the song. It just keeps going like that. On the second page here, you see a couple systems. What ends up happening, we have these sort of quick moving runs, and it's almost like the two voices are chasing one another. So if you look for recordings of this piece, you're going to hear a lot of performances like the one I was playing earlier, where you have two singers with equal voice types that are singing in canon with one another and supported by an instrumental bass. But, you know, when I was doing my own study of the piece, I noticed something, a couple things, that led me to a different conclusion about performance practice for this piece. When you combine the ranges of the two instruments, it spans a pitch space of 21 pitches. And this includes unused pitches that lie between the two voices. So that top C of the tenor and the bottom F of the cantus, counting the pitches in between there as well. We get 21 pitches total. The other piece of information, something that I noticed, was just by really looking at the pictographic score. If you look at the top of the harp frame, those silver-ish rectangles are tuning pegs. And the number of tuning pegs, of course, is going to be equal to the number of strings that you have. Well, of course, the number of tuning pegs doesn't match the number of strings on this depiction, because the strings are serving a symbolic role. They're supposed to look like strings, but we need them as staff lines, so we have many more than 21. But if you count the tuning pegs, you count 22 tuning pegs. So it's just one more string than you would need to perform this piece. And actually, harps from back then, around that time, did in fact have around 21, 22 strings, as pretty standard. Reinhard Straume actually proposed that La Harpe de Mélodie could have been performed by a solo singer accompanied by a harpist who's playing both the bass and canonically derived voices. He also suggested that the song might be, quote, a challenge, a virtuoso performance by a single musician, and an opportunity for an intimate dialogue with the composer's harp, his other self, which accompanies him as his shadow, which seems plausible. We know very little about the composer Jacob de Saint-Lèche, but we know that he was a harpist, so it seems like it makes sense. So my next question was, who were Saint-Lèche's patrons, and who commissioned the piece in pictographic score? And this is the question, really, that ultimately set me on the path leading me to compose this piece. La Harpe de Mélodie is contained within an illuminated manuscript that's now in the collection of the Chicago Newberry Library. and the manuscript's known as the Chicago Newbery manuscript. It's one of their prized holdings. It was copied around 1391 in Pavia, Italy, which is near Milan, and it's a place where Coalesce spent part of his career. The intellectual life and art patronage of Pavia was dominated by one family, the Visconti. They resided there and they held absolute rule over the city of Milan. This is before the Sforzas, who eventually took over. This is the head of the family, John Galeazzo Visconti. He was a renowned patron of learning, art, and music. He cultivated an enormous library at Pavia. It had one of the largest and most prized collections in Europe at the time. He commissioned the building of the Cathedral of Milan, and he was also famously the employer and patron of one of the most important poets in the history of poetry, Petrarch. Petrarch actually spent a lot of his most productive years living in the Visconti castle in Pavia. So John Galeazzo sounds like a pretty upstanding guy, but he really wasn't. He was a pretty ruthless, brutal tyrant, actually, and he seized power in Milan by conspiring to have the current leader imprisoned and poisoned to death. And then you find out that the person that he imprisoned and poisoned was his own uncle. So to remind everybody how brutal and ruthless he was, what lengths he'd go to hold on to power, he adopted this really charming image as his family's heraldic charge. It's a mythological creature, a serpentine dragon known as La Biccione. And here it's depicted on the edifice of a castle, brutally devouring an Ottoman Turk child, which they considered to be enemies. Here's just a close-up image. I actually work for 3 Italian priests who are all from Milan, and I remember showing this to them just to get a reaction, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, we see it all the time." It's like everywhere. It's everywhere in Milan. It's actually still the symbol of the city of Milan. They haven't even taken the kid out of the mouth of the serpent. They just say that the serpent is giving birth to the child. Yeah, so you see this image in all the books that were commissioned by the Visconti in their library, including this beautiful image. And now I come to the human subject and namesake of my composition, Valentina Visconti. She was John Galeazzo's daughter, and like her father, she was an active patron of the arts and music. And in fact, Eustache Deschamps was one of her closest friends, if you know that poet Deschamps. We know from contemporaneous accounts that Valentina not only played the harp and owned multiple harps, but she was incredibly accomplished. According to musicologist F. Alberto Gallo, the harp was the Visconti clan's most favored instrument. This, combined with the fact that Valentina herself was somewhat of a virtuoso, leads me to believe that La Harpe de Mélodie was composed not only for the Visconti family's particular interest in mind, but perhaps as a vehicle for her to showcase her talents. Perhaps she accompanied the composer as he sang. Maybe she played it and sang herself, as Reinhard Strom suggested. So here's where things get really bizarre and interesting about her life and really set things off in my mind when I was thinking about this piece. 1387, Valentina marries her first cousin, the Duke of Orleans, the brother of Charles VI, who was the King of France at the time. She relocated to Paris, brought an enormous entourage of attendants with her, several harps, but unfortunately it was not a happily ever after situation. She did love her husband greatly, according to all accounts. They remained in love, but her in-laws did not like her very much. The king was suffering from pretty severe mental health issues, and allegedly the violent bouts of rage that he would have got worse and became more frequent around the time that Valentina moved in. The king's wife and others at court reached for the most obvious conclusion, which of course is witchcraft. And they pinned it on Valentina, probably thinking about, what her father did in order to retain power. You can't trust those Visconti. So in 1396, she fled the French royal court. She never returned to Paris. This is a little snapshot of her doing that. She fled without her husband. She lived out the rest of her life in exile in Blois, which is a small city about 185 kilometers to the southeast of Paris. She never went back to Paris. In 1407, her husband Louis was assassinated in a political attack by 15 masked men in the streets of Paris. And Valentina died alone just a little more than a year later at the age of 37. This is a painting that I found when I was doing my research, painted in 1802, so 4 centuries after her death, nearly. And if you look at the stained glass window, you can see the image of the Biscione in the window. While she was in exile, Valentina had her room draped entirely in black, and she adopted this motto that you see on the screen: Rien ne m'éclut, plus ne m'est rien. Before I explain this, I just want to acknowledge the scholarship of Dr. Anna Klosowska, professor of French at Miami University. She is who I learned so much about this motto that I'm going to be explaining to you. She has a beautiful article entitled Tear Song, Valentina Visconti's Inverted Stoicism. We corresponded and talked about her writing, and it's been very helpful with the conception of my composition. So this motto, if we translated it sort of poetically, instead of literally, it would be, there is nothing more of or for me. And even contained within the phrase, there's this sort of clever moronic pairing of the words plus, which means more, and rien, which means nothing. So more and nothing at the same time. She also adopted this emblem of a chante-pleur and had it depicted on the walls of her chamber. This wood carving is from a 16th century book that just depicts and discusses a ton of emblems and mottos from European nobles. And you can see on the top her motto stretched across the emblem, or part of the motto, that is, plus ne m'est rien. If we translated this word chante-pleur literally, it would be something like tear song. And so this word tear song, along with the French motto, become the title of the third movement of my piece. What's really interesting is there's this 80-year-old Frenchman who lives in my neighborhood in St. Paul, and he likes to garden. And I overheard him talking one day, and the French actually commonly refer to watering cans as chante-pleur. So, it's, in this case, it's a symbol of sadness and mourning and ever-flowing tears that never stop, and you know, to the French, it means I'm going to go water my garden. So at this point, actually, I just want to hear a cue from the electronics at the toward the within this third movement of the piece, and it's an electronics cue that has sounds that are imitative of rain and sort of tear imagery. So I conducted this research several years ago, and I would return to it in my mind quite a bit because it was just so bizarrely fascinating to me. And gradually, over time, I developed the concept for the piece that you're going to hear tonight. The full work, honestly, is still it's in development. Tonight we will hear about 2/3 of the piece. And I think of it as a sort of multisensory electroacoustic monodrama in which the solo harpist takes on the persona of Valentina. And I'm sort of thinking of presenting an imagined scene near the end of her life in which she's confined to her chamber, her very bleak chamber, with only her harp to confide in. It unfolds as not as a linear narrative, but rather as a loose succession of vignettes that explore various mental and emotional states of the protagonist. And through the use of immersive audio and stage lighting, I've sought to engender an atmosphere that's not unlike that of a modern neo-noir psychological thriller. The way I've structured the piece is as a musical frame that encloses Jacob de Saint-Lèche's original chanson, which I've arranged for harp and voice based on the conclusions of my research that that's the intended mode of performance for this piece. There isn't a live singer that you're going to hear. The voice is disembodied and played by the electronics, and so it's sort of a representation of her inner voice. You're going to hear fragments of the chanson throughout the bookending movements. Sometimes it's quoted directly, other times more obliquely, or even in a distorted form. These musical snippets serve to represent reminiscences as they're filtered through Valentina's fractured psyche. I use electroacoustic techniques of spatialization and digital signal processing to contribute to a sense that these sounds that you're hearing are distant, foggy memories. And I just want to point out to everybody, we have 8 speakers on the floor here and then 6 in the ceiling and 2 subs. And I'm using all of these speakers tonight to move sound around the room during performance. Okay, so let's hear actually an example from the first movement where parts of the chanson are quoted and then we hear sort of these foggy memories. And actually I'm gonna In the closing movement of the piece, quotations used much more extensively and directly. This movement serves structurally as a sort of denouement and an overall feeling of sadness and resignation. Tear Song also serves as a commentary on La Harpe de Mélodie, which immediately precedes it in its entirety. Unlike the first movement, this closing movement quotes the original chanson more directly and continuously. However, its music obsesses over one motive in particular, which you can see here at the beginning of the movement. So Hope, if you could just play that one, those first two bars. In Sans Lèche's original chanson, this motive appears at the end of a phrase, a melisma that carries the words sans mélancolie, which in English translates to without melancholy. And if you remember, the song's text asserts that the harp is an instrument that exists for the express purpose of dispelling sadness. Medieval artists and composers, poets, they were very fond of juxtaposing concepts that were in opposition to one another for the sake of poetic irony. And I thought that it would be good to be in keeping with that spirit. So I chose this particular motive as the backbone of the ending of my concluding movement of my piece, which dwells on sadness and grief and emptiness. Like Valentina's motto, the idea of having nothing more of or for oneself. Another defining characteristic of this movement is the mercurial nature of the music, which moves quickly between states of sadness and elation. In her article, Dr. Klosowska discusses what she describes as, quote, an oxymoronic vacillation between joy and tears. It's an aesthetic tendency that appears frequently in the work of the poet Petrarch, who, as I said earlier, worked under the patronage of the Visconti. And so I've attempted to ingrain this aesthetic tendency into my own piece. So let's hear just the opening of this movement. course, my piece utilizes a number of musical materials that are not drawn from La Harpe de Mélodie. And many of these materials function to connect with imagery and concepts that I engaged with as I was composing. The first movement, entitled Dans les dents de la gifle, is one that sets up an atmosphere of desolation, anxiety, trepidation, which eventually gives way to abject terror. This is, of course, the image that I was considering. I got the title of the movement from a poem by Victor Hugo from his collection Les Orientales. And the poem it's a little dry. It's kind of a lengthy enumeration of European ensigns and coats of arms, but it describes the Visconti's heraldic charge in very graphic detail. He says, with the English translation, Rome has the keys, referring to the nice image of St. Peter with the keys of the city. Milan has the child still screaming in the jaws of the viper. Even he thought that it was time to change that up, and that was in the 19th century, so they still haven't done it. So this movement integrates quotations from La Harpe de Mélodie with materials that I've developed to correlate to the horrifying image of La Biccione. These materials represent both the sound and image of the creature, as well as the state of fear and anxiety one experiences in its presence. A primary characteristic of these materials is that they are noisy and agitated, and they move throughout three-dimensional space in many cases. So let's hear one short cue from the electronics alone that just demonstrates this. At the beginning of the piece, we'll be in total darkness, and you're going to hear this wash of noise, and what's happening is that Hope is going to be using a wire brush to rapidly stroke the low strings of her harp, which are, they're wire, so they make a lot of noise. And I'm capturing this sound with a microphone and transforming it by a computer in real time. It's transposed, it's filtered, it's passed through delay effects, and spatialized. So let's hear it and see it just without the electronics, but you can see what she's actually doing. So that sort of agitated, nervous nature of the technique. At the beginning of the piece, there's also a passage where she's playing from a page that looks like this, and it's an odd way to notate something. I'll just, read my performance note from the score. It says, the staff represents a range of about 17 consecutive strings, spanning a middle to high register of the instrument. The bottom and top lines represent the low and high limits of this range, respectively. Prior to performance, the harpist prepares the affected strings with thick felt so that they produce only a short, dull attack when plucked. The preparation should be done so as to retain a general sense of lowness and highness of pitch without the pitch being too focused. We won't hear an example of this right now, but just so you know, when we're in the dark, what's going on. When I was writing writing this passage, I basically created a mashup of rhythm and contour motives from La Harpe de Mélodie, and was thinking, you know, the choked effect that you achieve by muting the strings is adding to a feeling of desperation and anxiety. Just to briefly comment on the use of colored lighting during performance, we're using a particular hue of blue called ultramarine and several variations of that shade. It was a highly prized pigment during the Middle Ages. It's a go-to color for depictions of the Visconti's coat of arms. As you can see here in this image, that blue, that ultramarine blue. And if we go back to the pictographic notation of the score and look at the faces that are carved onto the harp on the upper right-hand side, they look sort of grayish green to us. But it's quite possible, actually, that they were bright blue when they were first, this manuscript was first copied. There's this sort of phenomenon called ultramarine sickness that's the name that chemists use to refer to it. And essentially, the pigment ultramarine, when it's exposed to elements over a certain amount of time, the color degrades, and we end up getting this sort of like sickly gray-green color. And so we actually have a sickly gray-green color that's at times mixed in with the blue that we're using tonight for the lighting to sort of just key into this concept as well. This is just an image of a famous painting that has suffered from ultramarine sickness. Just a few more comments about the music. Besides quoting the chanson, having sounds that are sort of imitative, mimetic of real-world sounds like the biscione, although that's not a real-world animal. It's not real, but it's, you know, it's an imagined one. And rain. I also sort of keyed into some musical concepts that were very popular during the so-called ars subtilior period in the 14th century, of which Jacob de Senlèche was a prominent proponent of. And some of those concepts, of course, I mentioned canon, the idea of canon. I sort of abstract that a little bit in my piece by using delay effects, and delay effects that are very long, so it's sort of like a modern day canonic effect. I sort of latched on to rhythmic complications from the ars subtilior period and sort of use those in my piece. I'll just show you a staff page, score page here that I didn't have in my slideshow. Oh, you put it in the other window. But these sorts of complications that you would see in the ars subtilior. So here I've got 5 dotted sixteenths in the time before dotted sixteenths in a 3/8 measure, and also it's accelerating from, I think, quarter note equals 72 to quarter note equals 104. I'm sure Hope had a lot of fun with that, so sorry about that. There's a lot more I could say about this piece. Visual and aural signifiers, but I think I'll let the piece speak for itself. I just want to say as a final note, you know, although this is inspired by specific circumstances in the life of a woman who's far removed from our own time, I intend for this work to confront more universal issues of anxiety, depression, grief, and isolation. So without further ado, we'll hear performance.